everybody, welcome to Bio World. This is the second part to my video on specialized animal tissues. My first video on specialized animal tissues discussed epithelial tissues, and the link for this video is in the description box below. So today we're going to discuss muscular tissues, nervous tissues, and connective tissues. Connective tissues include both the blood circulatory system as well as the skeletal system. Now, before I start my discussion on the muscular tissues, I would like to inform you that you can view two other videos related to the muscular system, that is muscle contraction and structure of sarcomere, which is part of the STPM Semester 2 syllabus. The links are provided in the description box below. Now let's move on to the muscular tissue based on the STPM Semester 1 syllabus. There are three different muscular tissues. The largest amount of muscular tissue is the type that is attached to our skeleton. So it is called the skeletal muscle. Then we have a group of muscles that form the heart. This is called a cardiac muscle. And then in our digestive system, we have a completely different type of muscle called the smooth muscle. By looking at the diagrams of these three muscles, you can clearly differentiate between them. The striated or skeletal muscles are single fibers which are not attached, whereas the cardiac muscles are fibers that are attached at certain locations. The smooth muscles remain as cells. They do not form a fiber. Besides that, you can see the nucleus in the striated or skeletal muscle is many. And all these nuclei are pushed to the periphery. Periphery meaning to the side of the cell. Cardiac muscles and smooth muscles have only one nucleus per cell, and they are positioned at the center of the cell. The next difference that you can observe is the presence of these lines, which we call as cross striations. Thus the name striated muscle. Skeletal muscles have very visible cross striations, whereas cardiac muscles do have some cross striation. Smooth muscles completely have no cross striations. Cross striations enable the muscles to contract rapidly. The skeletal muscle is controlled by the frontal part of the brain called the cerebrum. Therefore, it is known as a neurogenic muscle, since it can be controlled by the nerves, which we call neurons. And since it is controlled by the thinking part of the brain, the cerebrum, it is also known as part of the voluntary nervous system. So when we decide that we want to move our body parts, an impulse will be transmitted to the striated muscle, and this muscle then will do powerful, rapid contractions and relaxation. But the contraction and relaxation requires a lot of ATP, causing the muscles to fatigue quickly. That means these skeletal muscles become tired and eventually unable to contract. That is why after work we have to rest. Now the cardiac muscles are different. The cardiac muscles can do rapid rhythmical contraction and relaxation, but it is not a powerful contraction. And this contraction happens throughout our whole life. Otherwise, If our heart stops beating, we die. So you can see the cardiac muscle is a very special muscle since it can work without becoming tired. It does not fatigue. Now, the cardiac muscle is not controlled by the brain. Instead, it is controlled by specific nodes in the heart. Therefore, the cardiac muscle is called myogenic. The smooth muscle, of course, we find, since it has no cross striations, therefore, it does not contract rapidly. It is only able to do rhythmical contraction and relaxation. And since this is a very slow process, these muscles do not fatigue. And they are useful in process like peristalsis. The smooth muscles are also controlled by a different part of the brain known as the cerebellum. So this part of the brain is not the thinking brain. So we don't have to think and give instruction to the smooth muscle to contract. The smooth muscle will contract on its own. So this is called an involuntary nervous system. But since it still involves nerves from the brain, it is considered a neurogenic muscle. Now that we've completed the muscular tissues, let's move on to the nervous tissues. In semester 2, we will learn about the nervous system. So if you're interested, you can view my semester 2 videos on the organization of the nervous system as well as the characteristics of neuron. But now, let's focus on semester 1, where we are only going to discuss the nervous tissues. Just as how muscular tissues were made up of 3 different muscle cells, nervous tissues are also made up of 3 different nerve cells or neurons. The first is the sensory neuron, which can be found in the epithelial tissue layer. And the sensory neuron will detect impulse. So for example, if a fly happens to sit on the skin, an impulse will be generated, and this impulse will be transmitted along the sensory neuron to the brain. Now, the brain has the second nerve cell known as the interneuron. The interneuron will process this information and decide on an action, after which the impulse will be transmitted along the third nervous cell, that is the motor neuron. So the motor neuron will transmit the impulse to the muscle so that a response occurs. So in this case, the muscles will contract to enable movement. So in this way, the fly can fly away. So this is the first characteristic of nervous tissues, the fact that they are excitable. Excitable here meaning that they are able to transmit impulse. An interesting thing about the nervous tissues is that although they have nucleus, they are unable to carry out mitosis. So they are ameiotic. And this is dangerous because if your neurons are damaged due to physical injury or chemicals like drugs or alcohol, then these nerve cells cannot regenerate. So that is why it is important to take care of your spinal cord, brain, and other nerves. The nervous tissues use a lot of ATP to carry out the transmission of impulse. So they contain many mitochondria to generate energy. Let's continue now with the last tissue, that is the connective tissue. As mentioned earlier, the connective tissue involves 2 systems. Firstly, the skeletal system. Now, the skeletal system actually is made up of 2 parts, that is the cartilage found at joints and the bone itself. The cartilage and the bone together help to support the body. Now, inside the bone structure, we have the other group of tissues known as the hemopoietic tissue. The hemopoietic tissues will help to produce myeloid cells and lymphoid cells, which eventually form blood cells that travel along the blood circulatory system. So let's start first with the cartilage. The cartilage that is located at the joints are soft and they are made up of two layers. The outer layer of the cartilage is called the perichondrium, and the inner layer of the cartilage is called the chondrin, or also known as the matrix. Both the perichondrium and the chondrin are actually made up of fine collagen fibrils. Remember, collagen are actually proteins, secondary proteins. Now, in the perichondrium, the collagen fibrils are compact, making the perichondrium a bit harder, whereas in the chondrin layer, the collagen fibrils are loosely arranged, making the chondrin layer softer. In this chondrin layer, you have the cartilage cells. Cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. And usually, two chondrocytes are packed together in a space called the lacuna. So a cartilage will appear as in this diagram. The function of the cartilage mainly is to support and protect the skeletal system. It is able to support and protect because of these collagen fibrils. The collagen fibrils make the cartilage strong, whereby the cartilage can be stretched and yet it will not tear. At the same time, it is elastic, whereby it can be compressed but it will bounce back to normal. So this way, it is able to absorb vibration. Besides that, you find that the cartilage is able to reduce friction during movement at joints. Next, let's have a look at the bone. The bone is a much harder structure compared to cartilage. However, you will find some similarities between the bone and the cartilage. For starters, the bone is actually made up of the same collagen fibers that make cartilage. However, the collagen fibers are arranged in layers which we call as lamellas. Now, the collagen fibrils harden because it is added with inorganic salts which include calcium. Now, at the center of the lamella, you will find a Haversian canal. The Haversian canal will contain blood vessels and nerves. So, the whole bone structure is a series of Haversian systems. Each ring of circles here is called a Haversian system or an osteon. Now, within this lamella, there will be spaces called lacuna. Now, remember, the cartilage also had lacuna in its matrix. And in cartilage, the lacuna is where the cartilage cells, chondrocytes, were placed. So, likewise, in the bone, the lacuna is where bone cells are placed. Let me enlarge a lacuna for you. Now, the lacuna has tips here which we call as canaliculis. And in the center of the lacuna is where you have the bone cells which we call osteocytes. Now, the Haversian systems are connected to one another by what is called the Walkman's canal. Now, I have intentionally colored the Haversian canal, the Walkman's canal, as well as the canaliculis in red to indicate that all of these structures cooperate by connecting blood vessels, lymph vessels as well as nerves so that they can continuously transport nutrients, minerals, hormones, and waste material. So this is how the bones can keep each section of the bone alive. And when, say, there is a crack in one part of the bone, the other parts of the bone can send calcium to the broken part to heal itself. Now, to maintain the Hebesian system as a tightly arranged system, the outermost layer is made up of another type of collagen fiber. This outermost layer that makes bones smooth is called the periosteum. And to make sure the periosteum is tightly packed to the Hebesian system, we have collagen fibrils that move inwards called the Sharpie-Schaefer fibers. So this whole structure is how bones form. Now the function of the bone, as we already understand, is to support. So can you imagine if we did not have bones, our whole body would collapse into a lump. Now besides supporting, bones are also necessary to protect important organs. For instance, our heart. It is protected by the rib cage, or our brain is protected by the skull. The next function of the bone is, of course, to provide surface for the attachment of skeletal muscles. The bones also keep storing calcium for us as well as other types of mineral. And finally, the bones synthesize blood cells, which is going to be our next part of the discussion. In our backbone, there are bone marrow. The bone marrow contains hemopoietic tissues, which are also known as stem cells. Stem cells are cells that have not differentiated. Now, these stem cells then can differentiate to form all the types of blood cells in our circulatory system. To do that, the stem cells then will develop into myeloid stem cells. Myeloid stem cells will differentiate into erythrocytes. These are red blood cells that help to transport gas like oxygen and carbon dioxide. So in this blood smear, the erythrocyte are these circular cells which have no nucleus. Myeloid stem cells also produce platelets. You find them here as these tiny dots. They are necessary for blood clotting. Myeloid stem cells can also produce white blood cells like granulocytes. These are the cells that have granulated cytoplasm and lobed nuclei, such as this cell, or even this cell. And also monocytes. Monocytes are agranulocytes. These are white blood cells that have clear cytoplasm and a large nucleus. The nucleus is more like a bean shape. Now, the white blood cells are not only produced by myeloid stem cells. We also have another group called the lymphoid stem cells, which will produce lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are also agranulocytes, where they have a clear cytoplasm and a large nucleus. But the difference between the lymphocyte B and lymphocyte T nucleus with monocytes nucleus is that the lymphocytes nucleus is circular, whereas the monocytes nucleus is more of a bean shape. All these white blood cells are necessary for immunity, a topic we will discuss in depth in semester 2. So once all these blood cells are formed, these blood cells will be transported by the circulatory system. With that, we have come to the end of the discussion on specialized animal cells, where we have the muscular tissue, the nervous tissues, the skeletal tissue, and circulatory system, which makes up connective tissues. With that, bye-bye. See you soon.